In this video, we are going to focus on classical conditioning. One of the experiments that is most well associated with classical conditioning is the experiment with Pavlov's dogs, and we'll use that as an example in just a minute. But before we begin looking at the model, we really need to be familiar with the vocabulary, and many of the terms associated with classical conditioning sound very similar to one another. So here's a list of the 5 major terms that you will run into again and again when we talk about classical conditioning. So you do need to be familiar with these terms. You will use them again and again. And so I'm going to give you a brief overview. Unconditional stimulus is a stimulus that, when presented, will elicit a response. And this is something that is typically not learned. It is often reflexive or instinctual, like if I blow in your eyes, you're going to blink. So blinking, in this case, would be the response to a stimulus, the air being blown in your eyes. What happens is these unconditioned stimuli can make associations with other stimuli within our environment to get us to respond in a particular way. A neutral stimulus is a stimulus that doesn't elicit any response, or at least not the response that we're looking for. And so the neutral stimulus is the stimulus that, in classical conditioning, we're interested in conditioning or learning to make an association. The neutral stimulus will later become the conditioned stimulus. Once learning has occurred, the neutral stimulus is no longer called the neutral stimulus. It's now called the conditioned stimulus. And the conditioned stimulus will elicit a conditioned response. Now, the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are usually the same or very similar behaviors. They're the same or similar because what we're actually doing is training or making associations that allows that response to happen to a different stimuli. So let's look at a couple of examples. So first, before conditioning actually occurs, we're going to test and see whether there is any learned association presently. So in the case of Pavlov's dogs, what Pavlov did was make the dogs learn to salivate at the sound of a bell. Now, normally bells don't make dogs salivate. It was something that had to be conditioned or learned. So here, the neutral stimulus is the bell. When Pavlov would ring the bell, he would get no response from the dog, or at least not the response he was looking for, which was the dog salivating. The unconditioned stimulus was the dog food. Dogs, when presented with food, will automatically, instinctually, reflexively salivate. So the unconditioned response to presenting food is for the dog to salivate. So now we have an established unconditioned stimulus, which we will abbreviate UCS, and we have an established unconditioned response, which we will abbreviate UCR. We're going to use these abbreviations throughout the rest of the model. The neutral stimulus, or NS, is the bell. So the next step is the conditioning process. So during conditioning, what we're going to do is ring the bell, present the dog with food, and the dog is going to salivate. But right now, while the dog is learning to make the association, the dog is salivating because the food is present. Whenever food is present, the dog will salivate. Except each time I ring the bell, present the food, ring the bell, present the food, the dog is learning to make an association between the food and the bell. After conditioning or learning occurs, all I have to do is ring the bell and the dog will salivate. What happened is the neutral stimulus, the bell, became the conditioned stimulus because now the dog is responding just to the bell. No food has to be present in order to make the dog salivate. Now this model here is what I just went through, except it's all nicely organized on one page. So let's look at some other examples. Classical conditioning can be used to explain things like anxieties, fears, phobias, as well as other associations. A famous experiment by a researcher named Watson looked at whether he could teach or condition a child to be fearful or to cry when they see a rat. Now, this is the famous story of little Albert. Albert was not afraid of rats before the experiment. And if you watch the video on Blackboard, there is a series of clips in which Watson himself is testing the child's reaction to neutral stimuli. He presents a rat, a dog, a rabbit, a monkey, various furry and typically white stimuli to see what type of reaction Albert has. And of course, Albert's very interested and curious because he's a little baby, and seeing a white rat or a rabbit or a dog is very interesting to him. So after he establishes that Albert has no fear of the rat, what happens next is he tests Albert's response to a loud bang. He takes a metal pipe and a hammer and hits it really hard, and it makes this loud banging noise, which of course scares little Albert, who's only about a year and a half old. And Albert starts to cry, as any baby would when presented with a loud noise. Next, Watson pairs the small white rat with the banging sound. So he shows Albert the rat, Albert starts to play with it, and bang! Albert starts to cry. He takes the rat away, calms Albert down, again, brings back the rat, Albert starts to play with it, bang! Albert starts to cry. It only takes about 6 trials for Albert to be conditioned to fear or cry in response to the rat. So on the conditioned trial, where they see that learning has occurred, they present Albert with the rat, and Albert starts to cry. He not only is then afraid of the rat, he also generalizes this fear to anything small and fuzzy and especially white. So he cries when the rabbit is presented, he cries when the dog is presented. Watson even puts on a mask that has a white beard and hair. He cries when he sees that. So he's generalized this fear to anything small and fuzzy and especially white and fuzzy. So fears can be learned through classical conditioning, but that's not the only thing. Classical conditioning can also be used to help market ideas, to influence attitudes, to make you like things or not like things. One of the most brilliant marketing strategies that I can think of to date was employed by fast food chains to get young children to love eating at their restaurants. What they did is put toys inside of their meals to get kids excited about going to the restaurant and buying food. So toys are a stimuli that makes children happy. Now, it's probably not really an unconditioned stimulus, because the first time a baby sees a toy, it may not be happy about it, but it learns through experience that toys are happy, exciting, fun things. So then they paired their kids' meals with the toy, which made children happy, of course, and after repeated exposure of meals and toys, we find that children might get excited just by the presentation of the meal without the toy even having to be part of the scenario. And this is going to translate into later life, because the happiness, the excitement that you experienced as a child in going to this restaurant and getting this happy meal will make you associate happiness with that food or that restaurant in general. So even as an adult, going and getting food there may make you happy or excited, or you want it, and you might not even understand why you feel that associated happiness with that particular restaurant or food. Now, conditioning doesn't stop there. As I mentioned in the last scenario, toys may not be something that we naturally are happy toward, but we've learned happiness, and we can associate those toys then with other things. This is called higher order conditioning. This is how behaviorists explain that most of our learning occurs, that we conditioned a stimulus, which we then pair with other stimuli, and we condition those stimuli and condition those stimuli. So let me show you an example. So in this scenario, you are interested in buying a house, and you walk into the house with your realtor, and you smell these wonderful chocolate chip cookies, and it reminds you of the chocolate chip cookies that Grandma used to make. And you feel that this house is a warm, loving, friendly place, and you are now in love with this house and you want to buy it. This desire to want to buy this house, this love for this house, is actually due to classical conditioning, a higher order classical conditioning. So let's walk through this scenario using the higher order conditioning model. And I find it sometimes helpful, and you might find it helpful too, that instead of working down the model, we're going to work up the model. We're going to work our way backwards to the beginning, and sometimes that makes it a little easier. So we find that we're in love with the house. So why are we in love with the house? Well, what happened is we smelled those yummy cookies that remind us of Grandma. And so we make an association between the house, which used to be a neutral stimulus, and the cookies. And we love the cookies, so now we love the house. But cookies themselves were a conditioned stimulus. We didn't always love cookies. When we were newborn babies, we didn't go, oh, cookies, I love them, because we had no idea what a cookie was. Or whether we loved cookies or not was probably framed by some other experience. And so we would have to go back further to understand why we love these cookies. So probably what happened is Grandma used to make the cookies. Cookies were a neutral stimulus until we paired them with the love, the nurturing, the hugs and kisses and affection that we got from Grandma. And so whenever we smell or eat those cookies, we think about the love that Grandma gave us. So really, the whole reason that you want to buy this house is because Grandma loved you.